Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor.
Yes, stop! What the hell? Hello?
2001 was a year that would mark the beginning of a promising new century. As America entered this era, the nation faced many economic, environmental, and foreign struggles. What seemed to be a hopeful beginning would also bring tragedies. Some were domestic, while others would propel the United States along an influential path. The nation began to emerge as a leading world power and would come to shape future foreign events in the years to come. On April 7, 2001, a 19-year-old unarmed African-American, Timothy Thomas, was shot and killed by the Cincinnati Police Department's Stephen Roach. Preceding this incident, tensions were already high following accusations of racial profiling and police brutality. The death of Timothy Thomas was a spark to ignite a series of civil disobedience spanning from April 9th to April 13th. After the chaos settled, it was estimated that the riots cost $3.5 billion to businesses and $2 billion to the city. Another event that decimated cities was Tropical Storm Allison, a deadly hurricane that devastated the southern front of Texas. The storm continued to the east and settled in the mid-Atlantic. It lasted over 15 days. Its effects were seen in Houston, where 30,000 people are homeless and 3,000 homes were destroyed. Staying true to its campaign promise, 43rd President George W. Bush authored a series of tax cuts known as the Economic Growth and Tax Relief Reconciliation Acts of 2001. The bill lowered federal income tax rates and capital gain taxes. September 11, 2001 seemed to be a typical working day for New Yorkers as 50,000 people entered the Twin Towers. Unexpectedly, at 8:46 a.m., a Boeing 767 collided into the North Tower of the World Trade Center, killing all passengers on the plane. Soon afterward, NYPD and FDNY forces were dispatched to the area of impact. Approximately 20 minutes later, a second United Airlines plane crashed into the South Tower at the 75th to 85th floor. At this time, around 10,000 people were in the process of evacuating, with small hope for the upper floor workers. At 9:37, another hijacked plane crashed into the Pentagon, killing 125 personnel in the building. A lot of structural damage resulted from the plane crash into the Pentagon. With rumors of a terrorist attack, people evacuated the White House. Around an hour later, the South Tower collapsed. This was later followed by the collapse of the North Tower. Eventually, the World Trade Center Building 7 also collapsed. On Flight 93, as passengers learned about the events at the World Trade Center, crew members attempted to regain control of the plane, causing it to crash in a field at Somerset County, Pennsylvania.
A second airplane, a 727, just rammed into the building!
When United Flight 175 struck the South Tower at 9:03, Wells Crowther was on the 104th floor. He was a 24-year-old equities trader. He was also a volunteer firefighter in his hometown of Nyack. Somehow, he found an escape route past the inferno below and made 3 round trips up and down the stairs, carrying and leading survivors to safety. Wells' body was found 6 months later.
I used to work in the downtown in the New York City, so around 20 minutes away from the World Trade Center. So I go to the office after I get off from the PATH train. I walk around like 5 to 8 minutes to my office. So when I get to the office, I'm the only one in the office. So it's kind of strange. Then I turn on my computer and check on the internet. And then I found out like the World Trade Center is attacked, right? So some kind of terrorist attack. So then I just rushing downstairs and look at the people on the street. They're all looking up to the sky, to the same direction. Then I found out I see the World Trade Center is on fire and then there's some black smoke coming out from the building.
So I wasn't even alive during 9/11, but I know what it was like to grow up as a brown kid in a post-9/11 America. Some people came together and other people chose to, turn to hate against other people. I've seen and felt these sentiments expressed in public, and unfortunately I don't think they're going away anytime soon.
As a reaction to the 9/11 Al-Qaeda attacks, President Bush signed the USA Patriot Act into law. Similarly to the Alien Sedition Acts and the Espionage Act, this federal bill negatively impacted civil rights. It gave the government the permission to spy on technologies of potential terrorists. A week after the September 11th attacks, letters containing anthrax spores were mailed to several news media offices and 2 Democratic senators, Tom Daschle and Patrick Leahy. The lethal substance killed 5 people and infected 17 others. The war in Afghanistan attempted to dismantle Al-Qaeda's influence in Afghanistan by removing the Taliban from power. Following the September 11th attacks, President Bush condemned Osama bin Laden for the assault. With permission from NATO, the U.S. began its offensive in the area. During the war in Afghanistan, the U.S. Army was able to capture members of the Taliban government, but had a great struggle while trying to capture Osama bin Laden. This controversial war still remains to this day. As 2001 ended with a prolonged war, President Bush hoped to transition the country along a more positive path. He thus started off the year 2002 with a reformative federal law known as the No Child Left Behind Act. January 18th, President Bush signed the No Child Left Behind Act. This act ensured that children from poor families would not fall behind in education due to their financial struggles. It guaranteed that the federal government would support state governments in financing education for the poor by providing funds to help the states fulfill their set education requirements. The two subjects that the act focused on were math and English.
So No Child Left Behind was passed in 2001 and then signed into law in 2002. In 2003, New Jersey created the NJASC, the New Jersey Assessment of Skills and Knowledge, and I remember taking that test every year up until 6th grade. It wasn't necessarily the greatest test, but I think both NJASC and No Child Left Behind was a decent first start at trying to standardize education for kids around the country.
I'm a former school board member in New Jersey, and I had some experience with NCLB during the time it was being phased out and ESSA was being phased in. The reason that NCLB failed was there were no state and local school districts involved in its implementation and design, whereas ESSA was strictly state-driven. The problem with both was implementation. Neither of the efforts really went off well because they didn't make them child and student-centered. So much of what happened was driven by people's agendas at the federal level as well as at the state level. And in the end, the students got left behind. What was really the goal was to bring up the lesser achieving groups of students. And what happened was those very same students were not focused on or addressed by either the federal effort, NCLB, nor the ESSA. So these efforts carry on in new forms and shapes, but really the whole key to success is making things student-driven, and until that happens, none of these efforts are really going to prove to be fruitful.
On January 29th, Bush delivered his Axis of Evil speech, in which he stated that Iran, Iraq, and North Korea formed an axis of evil. He deemed these countries the axis of evil because he believed that they all supported terrorism abroad. Specifically, Bush believed that Iraq was in support of terrorist organizations. Iraq's leader, Saddam Hussein, possessed weapons of mass destruction. Bush thus intended for America's foreign policy to focus on a war against terrorism. The War on Terror was officially launched by the government after the 9/11 attacks against the United States. Overall, Bush believed that by waging war against terrorism, the international military campaign would help to protect future terrorist attacks from harming the nation. When the first detainees arrived at Guantanamo Bay, controversy erupted regarding the way in which they were treated. Most of the detainees were either captured from the Islamic terrorist organization Al-Qaeda or were captives from the Taliban government of Afghanistan. These detainees were sent to the U.S. Naval Base camp in Cuba, but were treated harshly, thus raising concerns for human rights. The questionable legitimacy of the Guantanamo Military Commissions complicated U.S. relations with Cuba. The Salt Lake City Winter Olympics were held in Salt Lake City, Utah during February. They marked the first time that a black athlete won a gold medal at a winter game. America's Vonetta Flowers took home the medal in women's bobsledding, with the United States overall counting in second place. However, during the competition, a scandal erupted in which the International Olympic Committee was bribed in order to give out certain awards to others. Here in July, one of the largest forest fires of the year occurred in Colorado. The Hayman Fire was a forest fire that started northwest of Colorado Springs, soon escalating to become the largest wildfire in the state's recorded history. Sparked by U.S. Forest Service employee Terry Barton burning a letter, the fire devastated around 140,000 acres of forest land and destroyed around 600 structures as well. Prior to the 9/11 attack, both the CIA and the FBI gathered suspicious information regarding the terrorist pilots. However, because they were unable to efficiently exchange information with one another, they failed to take action against the terrorist pilots. This gap in communication was closed with the Department of Homeland Security, a new federal government department that was established to help the FBI and the CIA easily communicate with each other. Serving as an intermediary organization between the two groups, the department helped prevent many future acts of terrorism. Carter's arguably most impressive achievement during his presidency was the Camp David Accords, a treaty which created the framework for peace in the Middle East. Prior to the Accords, Israel and Egypt constantly fought with one another. However, his negotiation of the Camp David Accords established a peace treaty between the two nations. His success in fostering foreign peace and his role in the passing of additional human rights acts led to Carter eventually being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002. As former President Carter ended the year of 2002 on a positive note, 2003 would present more conflicts and reforms. Carter's precedent for fostering peaceful relations with citizens and other nations would carry on into the following years. However, 2003 started off with an aeronautical disaster. 2003 began with a fatal accident in the Space Shuttle program known as the Space Shuttle Columbia disaster. NASA's STS-107 mission carried 7 crew members into space and conducted scientific experiments for 16 days. However, on February 1st, the Columbia disintegrated upon re-entry and no crew member survived the disaster. This disaster was likely caused by the damage created by a piece of foam on the spaceship that damaged the left wing. Following the catastrophe, NASA's Space Shuttle program was suspended for 2 years while they investigated the disaster and tried to improve upon the program. On a later note, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security officially began its operation shortly after. The agency helped to coordinate national efforts against terrorism. Due to a threat from weapons of mass destruction, the U.S. planned for an invasion in Iraq, and by March, the armed invasion officially began. At first, the U.S. and the U.K. started with their shock and awe campaign. This shock and awe campaign was a tactic that involved the use of overwhelming power to try to instill fear in the enemy forces during battle. The invasion included striking military targets in Baghdad before even invading Iraq. Because the Iraqi dictator, Saddam Hussein, refused the United Nations weapons inspections and was declared to have weapons of mass destruction, President Bush declared to launch Operation Iraqi Freedom, which led the war in Iraq. Operation Iraqi Freedom illustrated the Bush administration's pledge to use unilateral, preemptive strikes against nations believed to be dangerous to UN national security. Hussein was eventually captured in Tikrit by the U.S. 4th Infantry Division. By May, a major weather outbreak spawned more tornadoes than any week in U.S. history. 393 tornadoes were reported in 19 states, and they were so often accompanied with other forms of severe weather, including strong thunderstorms, wind, and hail. Over the course of the year, almost 1,400 tornadoes were reported. Following 9/11, armed undercover sky marshals were developed to be used on aircraft in order to prevent further terrorist attacks. However, as the nation was developing, there were more natural disasters on the way. A major hurricane that hit the east coast of the U.S. in 2003 was Hurricane Isabel, which claimed around 40 lives and left 6 million people without power. This hurricane was the deadliest, costliest, and most intense hurricane of the year. It formed from a tropical wave in the Atlantic Ocean and caused $50 million in damages to the state of New Jersey. Another natural disaster that occurred in 2003 was the California St. Simeon earthquake, which struck the central coast of California in December, officially becoming the most destructive earthquake to hit the United States since the Northridge quake of 1994. Some important Supreme Court cases were Lockyer v. Andrade and Ewing v. California. Lockyer v. Andrade provided that any person convicted of a crime for a third time must be sent to prison for at least 25 years. Ewing v. California upheld this three-strikes law and ruled that the Supreme Court did not need to second-guess states' policy choices. Additionally, in Greta v. Bollinger, the court upheld affirmative action and university admissions. Goodrich v. Department of Public Health ruled anti-gay laws against same-sex marriage couples as unconstitutional in Massachusetts. The various court cases during 2003 demonstrated the continuation of the Supreme Court involvement in progressives. As 2003 came to a close, the events that occurred within the past 3 years proved to be fundamental for the future. Each new century comes with a new form of life. As Americans, young and old, began to live their lives in the 21st century, they became immersed in their culture as well. From new shows to new music to new films, everyone seemed to have finally found a way to enjoy themselves. During 2001, some important films that were released this year include Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, as well as Shrek. These were some of the very films that would grow popular among the 21st century kids and future generations of that century. During this year, popular musicians such as Alicia Keys and the band U2 also rose to prominence. Other than musicians and films, some modern TV shows of the 2001 year include The Simpsons and Everybody Loves Raymond. In 2002, some movies that grew popular were Spider-Man and Ice Age. Taking the top spot at many US box offices, these animated films were the basis of many modern remakes. Prominent musicians of the 2002 year included the Rolling Stones and Linkin Park. In 2003, movies that especially rose in popularity were Pirates of the Caribbean and Finding Nemo. Some popular musicians of this year were Elton John and the band Blink-182. The rising popularity of the music industry led to ABC's 2020 airing of the controversial Granada television documentary Living with Michael Jackson. Apple also launched its iTunes this year.
Finding Nemo played a pretty big part of my childhood because of the fact that, it's just an adorable movie. And, I used to watch it in preschool, elementary school, middle school. And, it was just a really big deal for a lot of kids growing up.
Reflecting on the years of 2001 to 2003, it is clear that President Bush had led the country through both opportune and arduous times. However, his leadership would not be forgotten when in 2004, he once again defeats the Democratic nominee for the presidency. That's on the next episode of The Century, America's Time.